All right. Thank you very much again for joining. And my name is Mark Pizzato. I've recently published this book, and it's now available in hardcover as well as ebook. And I'll get right to my presentation, sharing my screen, and then we'll have some response from our designated scholars in Buddhism, Bill Chu, and also Shakespeare studies with Rob Conkey. But I also want to let the rest of you respond too. So I'll try to limit myself to about a half hour. Can you all see my screen? Or someone tell me if you
Yes,
can. Okay,
yes, I can see it.
thank you, Bill. Um, okay, that's at the begin. That's at the end. Let's start at the beginning. So this is the book and our meeting time. I want to mention that I started my application of neuroscience to theater and film about 2 decades ago with this book focusing on ghost characters, especially in Shakespeare, but also ancient Egyptian, Greek, and Roman theater and Japanese no theater, as well as modern drama and film. I was inspired by Bernard Bars, a cognitive psychologist who was already using theater metaphors in the late 90s. And his global workspace theory is still a prominent model for how our brains work and the very limited space of consciousness at each moment, which Bars calls, spotlight, and how it relates to many other subconscious functions, and how that also involves then, in Bars's sense, the players on stage and the contextual operators behind the scenes, including an unconscious audience that is both the automatic skills we have and memory systems and motivational systems in Bars's terms. He also emphasized how there are frameworks for consciousness, and how he calls them scene setters as well. I then published a book in 2011 focusing on gods, angels, and devils, and looked at theater history, which is something I teach every year, and how that relates to recent films with these kinds of characters, and a TV series from the late 90s called Millennium. And then in 2016, I also focused a book on vampire, werewolf, and ape planet movies, plus lab-created hybrids as beast people, how that relates to the networks of our brain and staging self and other consciousness. The current book is now available, and you'll see a little possible link here if you go to the Bloomsbury website later. If you click on that, it'll send you to the bottom of that page, and then you can click and reach this platform that Bloomsbury has created, which I'm very grateful for. It was part of my initial seeking of a publisher who would do this, because I wrote the book with hundreds of photo illustrations specified, within the writing, along with dozens of videos to give a more complete experience to the reader. And the publisher was able to include 40 of the pictures in the book, but also created this website, which is free and open access. So even without buying the book, you can experience the illustrations. In the book, I have a list of the various sites in Europe that I chose for what I hope to be a series of books. In fact, I've started the sequel already, and I'm traveling to England in June to try to visit more. But with this first book, you can see I selected from various countries, my prior trips, and many cities, including Israel, which unfortunately has become even more relevant in the last 6 months, because as I was writing the book, I felt the connection to the Holy Land for the development of Christianity in the various Christian sites was important, but also the conflicts between religions and ethnic groups. Italy was also featured in the book, and Rome especially. So the total is about 53 sites out of over 500, about 10% that I visited in the course of about 10 years or so, with help from funding from my department and also the College of Arts and Architecture at UNC Charlotte. And of course, I did have the opportunity to go to China and make the comparisons in the book then as well, with about 28 sites, and that's about 20% of what I visited. This is the basic ground plan that I found, although many variations. Sometimes just a one-hall basilica for Christian churches, but often with the cruciform transept and the unilinear focus on a main altar and high altar area with relics, sometimes in a crypt below. But that unilinear focus from west to east is a key part of this, as well as the enclosure of the sacred space, in comparison with Chinese temples that face south and have multi-directional emphasis. People come in and they bow 3 times in each of the 4 cardinal directions with incense usually, and they go visit the various shrines along the sides and back. Of course, these are monasteries as well usually, so they're monks' areas that are more private too. But there is a central axis usually, but not a build toward one holy of holies sites that would be, exclusive also, as in the Christian tradition, for priests. So there are more openness of these areas because it's a walled enclosure with roof shrines, but openness between them. So extended courtyard, often with trees and plants, and sometimes rain or snow that I experienced. So keep this in mind as I'm going through the more theoretical issues. The first question, and I'm going to focus on 3 to summarize the book. With the many differences across such buildings, what might be a common source in our animal-human drives and emotions, especially with regard to a greater meaning for suffering in this life? So this is a table I developed in my previous books, also with the help of David Basher, a colleague in biology at UNC Charlotte that some of you know passed away about a decade ago, but before that helped me a great deal to explore an evolutionary perspective in neuroscience of how our animal-human drives or remnant instincts might relate to primary emotions and then more complex social emotions, as well as human cultural extensions of those, and religious ideals regarding this book. So these are also building on one another. So survival is most basic, shared with all animal life, along with reproduction in some way. And then territoriality, often with other species too, and nurturing care, as well as alliance hierarchy. More distinctively with humans, although other mammals play at a young age, humans extend that through our symbolic species and culture. And then play is a way that we have of reorganizing and making meaning of these other levels with more distinct higher order consciousness and social connections with belonging that in primates involves grooming, and in humans gossip, and then belonging in religious sense as well. Good versus evil is part of the problem of those identifications that I'm going to mention more later. And then seeking immortality with meaning and purpose at the highest, or more distinctively, human level and religious goal. Notice how the red relates to more subcortical trickster, the deepest brain areas of survival, and then the right more, not totally, with the right cortical, which I call also maternal, because it involves the reproduction drive and nurturing care. Territory, which is in men too, of course, but that heritage of the maternal, and left cortical patriarchal with more territorial and alliance hierarchy drives, which of course are expressed very much in religions as well. So there are about a dozen different brain networks that I've given further theater metaphors to, especially using the social neuroscience of Matthew Lieberman and Mario Beauregard. I'm going to focus for this talk, and the book does too, especially on the audience network, again inspired by bars, and how that involves our memories and intuitions. Scriptwriter critic, more left hemisphere. Mime improviser designer, more right hemisphere. And then the stagehands, the deepest level. So that's also related to work by Bars and other neuroscientists. And this involves the animal-human heritage as well. Whoops. Animal-human heritage of our fish reptilian ancestors, the deepest level, the limbic system in the middle between our prefrontal cortex and the deeper level is the more audience area. And then we also have primate ancestors with our parietal cortex, but the left hemisphere is shown here. You have to imagine the right on the other side. And that again would be the more scriptwriter critic or mime designer. So question number 2. While religious buildings evoke awe, as paradoxically both fear, smallness, and elevation, that's been studied, hope and community, how do they also reflect the hyper-theatrical problem of melodramatic or political melodrama in theater too, with good versus evil, victim, hero against villain, group identifications and projected stereotypes, or tragicomic alternatives that are more complex. So melodrama developed as a term in the 18th century, but especially on stage in the 19th, and then as a dominant mode into our screen media, and now current politics. Good versus evil, focusing on clear-cut heroes fighting monstrous villains while saving or avenging victims. And there's an alternative to that. Obviously, maybe some problems with it as far as projecting stereotypes onto other people or groups, but an alternative in the theatrical tradition of tragic or tragicomic scripts and shows and ways of participating. So that goes back to ancient Greece with Aristotle and the idea of catharsis. I use the terms in capital letters here from the work of affective neuroscientist Jaak Panksepp, because he uses capital letters to distinguish how the animal-human drives are different from, but produce our conscious experience of emotions. And so he also explored that with animals, how their behavior indicates these kind of primary drives. So tragic sympathy with the hero's courageous seeking, and yet realizing through plot twists and recognition moments his tragic flaw, error in judgment, and how that leads to the tragedy at the end and affects the audience with questioning and understanding of the complexity of their admiration and yet problems with the hero. This relates to an alternative tradition in ancient India, going back just as far or so, approximately about 2,000 years ago, of rasas, of the flavors of emotions, and how they relate to Bhava's emotions themselves in the fictional piece on stage. and 8 of them defined, along with about 1,000 years ago, the 9th rasa of peace as a goal of theater, to raise awareness and then peaceful understanding in the spectator. With melodrama, I would say more fear, anger, and yet courage, positive sense of these emotions are emphasized, and whether those lead to the 9th rasa of peace, maybe not. Maybe it's more immersion in cheering for the good guys against the bad guys, and then that justifying violence with a big battle toward the end against the villain, as well as stereotypic projections of who might be the villain. So I see that related to the predator heritage, according to Ian McGilchrist in his book, The Master and His Emissary. He's also published a huge 2-volume book recently called The Matter with Things, where he goes into even more detail. But he summarized already earlier the research from about 2 decades regarding left and right hemispheres. Unfortunately, when this was first discovered in the 1970s, it became popularized in an oversimplistic way. But neuroscientists like McGilchrist have revisited and reconsidered how there are different characteristics between left and right hemisphere. So the predator heritage, because it can be found in other animals as well, left hemisphere specialty when hunting, other food objectifying prey, relates to our very useful abstract analytical thinking, focus, and tool using. But that often inhibits the right hemisphere's more prey or mate heritage with a broader awareness, with care and cooperation, as I mentioned before, perhaps related more to maternal functions or nurturing care by males as well. And then emotional sensory intuition. Also very critical to this book and my exploration of architecture and art in religious sites, the rectilinear, unidirectional, fixed, and mechanical characteristics of left hemisphere in relation to, inhibiting or balanced with, the round, circular, flowing, and natural appreciations of the right hemisphere. That's from McGilchrist. And then McGilchrist also points out that Western research shows Western strategies skew more toward the left, and East Asian cultures use both hemispheres more evenly. I'll go into more details on that. But it also involves using categories that focus on individual components versus attending to broad fields, analyzing with one-dimensional rule-based responses or less formal logic and more intuitive, seeking one correct answer over its binary opposite, or contradictory views for dialectical synthesis and compromise. So those, especially along with the independent, interdependent at the bottom, relate to melodrama and the alternative tradition from the West, but also, in my view, helped by rasa theory, so I even call it rasa catharsis, from India. So the focus of the book is on monumental dimensions, spatial designs, and then the possible emotions evoked as well as reflected at the religious sites. It also involves original sin as a doctrine in Christianity, and how that is a way of understanding greater purpose and meaning to human suffering, with redemptive sacrifice emphasized by Jesus on the cross, and also saints or martyrs. In comparison with Buddhism, as well as I make comparisons to Confucianism and Taoism, but with Buddhism, the idea of original delusion as increasing human suffering, and therefore the solution is not further suffering devoted to God, but non-attached equanimity, realizing non-self and accepting change through interdependency. Question number 3, my last question, while concluding. How do these sites with monumental designs and performance spaces involve inner theater, elements of self and other consciousness? Hopefully you have a sense of that already. But I'm also of course, exploring how that would relate to patriarchal, maternal, and supportive trickster aspects. And one other issue I'm bringing up at the end here, high arousal, positive, nature-dominating ideals, or more balanced, harmonious affects. So it's important to remember that when we talk about the inner theater of each of our minds and the brain networks involved, that those develop through interpersonal relationships that are unique to each of us, starting in the family and then extending to the social theater of school, work, and especially today, social media. For believers, it also involves a cosmic framework, a theater of gods or spirits interacting with us. And so again, I'm comparing those involving the different European and East Asian traditions of patriarchal authority and maternal care, as well as tricksters or less desirable spirit interactions, plus the personal and collective memory patterns. So psychologist Jean Tsai and her colleagues have explored this issue of high arousal positive as a more ideal affect in the European and Euro-American tradition, whereas low arousal positive more in East Asian and Asian American. So they've done a lot of experiments and gathered data as cultural psychologists to make these comparisons, which also relates to emotions in the wheel of model of Russell and Barrett, again on the, as you see, axes of arousal, high or low arousal, valence meaning pleasure or pain, positive or negative valence. And then Tsai and her colleagues find more independent model of self or interdependent in the Western and Eastern traditions. More specifically, she has explored how this relates to sacred writings. So the Christian Bible and its ritual practices, the Buddhist sutras and ritual practices, involving more stress on high arousal emotions or low arousal. Jesus' energizing power, passionate quality, that's from her research, and Buddha's cool, dispassionate, calm. She's comparing Buddhist sutras translated into English, by the way. She acknowledges that. And heaven involving high arousal, positive, or nirvana, more low arousal. So she summarizes this as the importance of how ideal affects are different in these different traditions, and how that involves an ideal of acting on the environment and influencing others in the Western context with an independent model of self, more interdependent with East Asian and Asian Americans in her research, changing oneself or dissolving ego, that would be the Buddhist idea, to be consistent with others. More, I relate that across the line here then to the melodramatic mode, more purely good versus evil, and righteous, vengeful violence. Again, perhaps involving more of the left cortical functions as scriptwriter critic, dominating over the subcortical trickster. And then the tragic comic awareness, more in the East Asian tradition, with complex protagonist versus antagonist, and with ironic changing distance perspectives, balancing the various brain areas. There's actually a longer tradition, a couple decades or more, of cultural psychology finding various comparative aspects to Western and East Asian cognition, summarized here as the individualistic abstract rule, linear thinking, so more left cortical, or East Asian more, that is balance between the left and right cortical with more of the holistic, relational, contextual, cyclical thinking. So, coming back to design elements with the religious buildings, this is how I started my investigations, and then explored what I had experienced in retrospect using the imagery that I'm sharing with the website and the book. So again, the unilinear focus of the Christian church tradition, and I go back to how that developed historically, with the highest Holy of Holy area, also vertical spires, higher and higher. And then what happens in those, which I'm going to explore more in the sequel that I'm writing now, more on imagery and performance at religious sites. Compared with the more multi-directional with Chinese temples and the openness, so enclosed versus open again, involving then more of the left cortical, perhaps in some ways melodramatic mode, which I'm trying to briefly share here with just a few images as examples. The Church of St. Michael, High Church of St. Michael, a Lutheran church in Hamburg, Germany, with Jesus on the cross, raised up high here, perhaps with, I want to acknowledge, I was raised in the Roman Catholic tradition, very much aware of the tragic comic dimension in believers' relationships to Jesus or the saints, especially to Mary in that tradition and in Eastern Orthodox. Because, the birth of Jesus, as well as the earlier Annunciation to Mary as joyful, and then the tragic development of her awareness to an experience of her son's death on the cross, brings together a complexity, as might any believer's or visitor to a church relationship to its design and imagery. So there is that dimension in Western culture. But I also found researching and reflecting on my visits with this book, more of the high arousal, positive and negative, or negative turned into positive, of Jesus' resurrection, conquering sin, death, and evil, along with other martyrs idealized for that, with sometimes gruesome imagery of their suffering, and angels like Michael or St. George on horseback, conquering Satan, like this image at the front of St. Michael's in Hamburg. So one comparison here is with between two sites, is the Lingyan Temple in Hangzhou, China, with more emphasis, at least in what I see, of, based also on cultural psychologists, wider research, the low arousal, positive and negative, middle way of tragicomedy, with non-attachment, equanimity, and self-dissolution. This is, gathering of laity and monks to chant near the Buddhist statues. And then behind, so again, it's not all unidirectional, but an important area right behind is I'm not sure it's the same hall, but typically behind the main Buddha statue in many of these shrines is a Guanyin figure. Guanyin, the Bodhisattva of compassion, who actually changed from male to female, going from India to China. And she rides on a fish dragon, but she's not conquering it or nature. She's represented that way because she is especially shown here as mistress of the seven seas, or compassionate towards fishermen and sailors. And so you can see a kind of compassionate balance. She also pours, I don't know if you can see it, it's very small, but pours from a vase her compassion towards others. And that's a balance, I see, more of the low and high arousal, positive and negative, and the various brain areas. So finally, concluding for today, this talk, the 5 hypotheses in the book, which I come back to at the end of the book to see how they're confirmed or complicated, that both traditions involve the rectilinear and upright monuments, reflecting left cortical, patriarchal, scriptwriter, critic functions, and have curved, inclined, more right cortical, maternal circuits reflected, as well as nurturing drives, with some elements of the supportive trickster image and edges involving limbic audience and subcortical stage hand networks. But the contrasts also appear between the European churches as enclosed unified monuments, reflecting more left cortical, individualistic, patriarchal characteristics. There's a lot of that in Chinese temples too, but there's more domination of nature and more binary, polarized good versus evil. Again, more melodramatic, one might say. Objectifying mechanical left hemisphere toward victory and focusing the visitor in a more unilinear direction with high arousal, positive. Chinese temples, in contrast, more holistic, collectivist, right hemisphere, and multi-directional, open air, dispersed halls, mostly wooden, by the way, compared with stone and brick, and therefore more connected to nature or harmony with nature with dialectical yin and yang ideals too in the Taoist tradition, and cyclical change as part of that, with a mix of low and high arousal and positive and negative. And then European churches having vertical spires, low to high arousal, with narthex to nave spaces reflecting more left cortical, territorial, hierarchical, again, relating to the beginning of my talk in those animal-human drives, melodramatic, bounded. There's also the issue of bounded or permeable identities in the book. And individual group competition. So it's the community that then becomes competitive against other communities identified as threats or evil, which is part of our secular politics also. Chinese temples, in contrast, seem to involve more, or I should say less verticality, except with huge statues and pagodas, but the overall design less vertical and more horizontally shamanic, with reflecting left and right cortical balance and with multiple halls as well, porous collective yards, and showing of tragicomic, therefore, awareness of interdependent relations, and perhaps, at least in the tradition, of course, modern China has changed this greatly with communist atheism first and now the revival of temples, but Chinese geopolitics has changed in competition with the West, but more in the tradition, more cooperation between religious traditions, not the brutal bloodshed of the many centuries of religious conflict in Europe. So I'm going to stop sharing here. I can always go back to slides if anyone's interested, but I do want to ask first Bill and Rob if you'd like to respond at all. Any comments or questions?
I'll say a few words. I think, I've known Mark for many, many years. I think the idea of in a neurotheater is such a important one, at least from a Buddhist perspective, because the Buddhist is very much focused on inner psychology. So the idea is, what you experience, including your suffering, is a construction of your mind. That is a basic tenets of the Buddhist teaching, which is a little different from the Western traditions, much more emphasized from ancient times. And from that perspective, the theater is, I think it's a very apt analogy, even though, I don't think the ancient Indians and Chinese necessarily think that way, but it's, that it's a natural extension to it. And so I think that is an important theme. And it's really interesting to look at these, the churches and temples. At least in the case of Chinese temples, there are two threads. Historically, we know that. One thread is the temple was basically modeled uh, after the palace, the Chinese palace. So this is not an Indian creation. This is a Chinese creation. The first temples that was erected in China when Buddhism first came to China was just pagodas, was just a tomb of the Buddha, sort of something that resembles the tomb of a Buddha. And the temple was a later creation. It is not an early creation. So so as much as it resembles the structure of a basilica, it's a fascinating reflection of the inner working of the mind, because the structures, there's a lot of similarities between the two, but culturally they're independent. I don't see that sort of there's any common ancestors to it. So that's one end to it. The other end is, of course, Mark talks about high arousal, low arousal, but that's, more about Buddhist philosophical beliefs, and that is more reflected in the figures and the carvings as opposed to in the architecture of the buildings. The architectures of the buildings are in the Chinese case was patented after palace. So it's interesting to see the convergence from those two different completely different sources.
Well, that's
And
interesting. Well, thank you for mentioning that, because in the book I do consider what other scholars find as origins of Christian worship space going back to the beginning, and how the domestic space was also a model, but it was in the catacombs with communing with the dead, or in ancient Roman homes, the table for a meal, and the atrium too, with an impluvium of water, where rainwater was collected and they could use that for baptism. So there are scholars who explore that domestic origin. As you mentioned, the palatial background to the development of Chinese temple architecture is an interesting parallel. But again, even those show different attitudes, because in the Christian tradition, once Christianity was made the dominant religion of the Roman Empire, first accepted by Constantine and then the 400s by Theodosius, proclaimed as the only religion, the basilica, which was the Roman meeting hall for commercial enterprises and for a judge, that became turned, actually, sort of as more of a processional focus on the main altar, but also that huge hall enclosed, then rising higher and higher vertically, combined with the domestic space. And as some have argued, excluding the maternal or female dimension. So there was much more of that when it was initial home meetings, and women involved more. And then the patriarchy took over, which is reflected in the worship space. And by the way, I visited a few nunneries in Hangzhou and other places in China, so I could compare those as well. Very similar architecture, and interesting ways in which balance is an ideal, along with sometimes the Chinese temples are arrayed along a hillside to match the flow of nature, the feng shui, wind and water principles, instead of dominating the site, which is typical of a Christian cathedral or big church. Rob, do you want to offer anything from the theater side or relate to Shakespeare? Because I was going to mention The Tempest. That's my favorite Shakespeare play, involving mix of tragic and comic elements, where Prospero seems to be the hero that we should follow, getting his revenge against his enemies, but that gets turned around, which, for those of you who know the play, is an example of what I mean by tragicomic complexity.
Absolutely one of my least favorite plays. But let me first say congratulations on the publication of the book. It's always a massive achievement, and just looking at the archive that's behind it, let alone the just ridiculous amounts of interdisciplinary theory that you've had to wrestle into some kind of shape is somewhat mind-boggling. I'm not sure which part of my brain is hurting the most, but it's one of those cortex bits. And so you've asked me to respond as a Shakespearean, and so I mean, this is not an area of theatre history that I've pursued at all, but I have sort of noted it in passing of people talking about the construction of the Globe Theatre using something called sacred geometry. And I don't know all, I know the angles of the tennis court better than I do the sacred geometry, but I mean, one of the basic things is of the thrust stage, the square within the circle of the wooden O, the 20-sided globe, and the various ways by which the dimensions are achieved. And yesterday in class, I had an oral assessment with my Shakespeare on Film students, and they were tracing moments with reference to Shakespeare in Love at the end of that film, where you have the perspective on the stage up into the galleries as the play closes, and there's this moment of pause and then a euphoric response. This sort of fantasy about the very first production of Romeo and Juliet, and then they were tracing that moment in other films and in their own personal experience, and so that makes me think about moments when the particular adherent or worshipper in any of these buildings, either in their original context or indeed today, comes to the sort of the sacred space where there is a front, or where there's a space from which some kind of priest figure delivers their performance. What happens when the worshipper goes to that space and looks back to the congregation, for want of another phrase? And I shared with you the other day that I had such an experience when I graduated my PhD in Winchester Cathedral and looked back on an entirely full, and it was quite awesome. And my teenage church going was that the baptismal font was at the front, and then post-baptism you would look back to the congregation. And I suppose another sort of in the Christian tradition would be going to the front to accept the wafer. But the other thing about that that image from Shakespeare in Love, of course, is that the theatre is packed, and that many of these buildings, and it strikes me that a post-academic career that you've carved out must be a tour guide of Europe and Asia around these magnificent places with information about everything. But it strikes me that often these vast spaces are not populated to the degree that perhaps once they were. And that makes me just reflect on that maybe those spaces are not so populated, but that our various brain spaces are completely overpopulated when we might be visiting them as contemporary experiences of that kind of sacred space. So the last thing I was thinking about was the square within the circle that's about to receive $60 million upgrade at the university. Now, that is truly a religious experience.
The football stadium.
Yes, indeed. Anyway, in closing, once again, massive congratulations, and thanks for sharing, and look forward to seeing it as a physical object.
Thank you for sharing that, Rob, and I hope to talk to you about the Tempest later. We can debate the value of it, but what you're reminding me of is how the unidirectional focus on the priests at the altar, with, of course, the sharing of the bread, perhaps the wine near the end of the service, and then keeping that in the Catholic tradition as well as a sacred body of Christ, at all times with a little red candle showing where that is for some people to pray toward as a connection to God, is a way to involve the laity in the platform performance space. But that's been increasing, in recent times. And in the Middle Ages, it was screened off typically, and the screens are still there in many English cathedrals. So there's also, the difference between being more spectators and being more participating in the performance space. So I have to think more about that as maybe for this second book that I'm writing as well. I'm glad you brought that up. And it's interesting to think about the Globe, because I hope to visit the reconstruction of it in London next month again and watch a show or two there. But the standing area, around the stage, as well as the seating area for higher class spectators, is a way of mixing different parts of society and intimacy with the thrust stage. I think that's, again, as you mentioned, how church attendance is declining, how the spaces, are not as packed, how much more of our spiritual connections involve this kind of online thing we're doing now, as well as screen media. Again, is part of my impetus to consider the melodramatic temptations in the church and temple comparisons, and which seeing that more as a problem in the Western tradition, because I see it as so prevalent in our screen media now, and in the current election year politics in the US. Would anyone else like to jump in with comments or questions? Good to see you, Andrew Fairweather, too. Andrew does great talks and leadership of discussions through the New York Public Library, which I would highly recommend. Anyone else want to add? Yeah, go ahead, Aaron.
Hey, Mark, thank you. I think you need an assistant for this project. Un collego parla italiano. So, in the Italy trip, you let me know. I've got a lot of time next summer. But anyhow,
Okay.
you mentioned catacombs a bit back, and I don't know if this is part of your project, but have you theorized, considered, you guess the performance or rhetorical aspects of the sub areas? Because I have never been in a basement of a church in the United States, but I have been to them in Italy. And the church in my dad's hometown is really just an office area for the priest. But when I did a study abroad in Salerno, and I'm going to put this in the chat, so you just save that for later if you want. The sub area is very vibrant. And so but again, I don't know if this is part of your project or not. So have at it.
Well, thank you. I do consider the crypts in some churches, including in Italy, because they're very interesting spaces, right? For usually a relic of a saint, actual bones, sometimes displayed, and therefore a kind of memento mori, a contemplation on mortality area, as well as a pilgrimage attraction, at least in past centuries, which produced revenue for the community, for the city or town, and sometimes funded, bigger and bigger churches or towers on them too. So that crypt space, probably related to early Christian use of catacombs as worship spaces too. I view, in relation to the subcortical, deeper body-brain connections that we have of our inner theater, and then how I even, consider in the book that there's a post-mortem fuel that comes from the belief in the holiness of those bones from saints that inspires people, and the spires that rise at the top. So that is very interesting to me, your own examples of the, going deep in the earth, as well as the verticality of the appearance from the outside, and even, looking up at the vaulted ceilings in big churches. Anyone else? Yeah, go ahead, Teresa. Oh, you need to unmute though.
I was just going to bounce off on that because I've been in many different types of churches, but only in the U.S. I confess, except for reviewing. But sometimes that underspace is like more communal, like it's where the kitchen is, it's where the classrooms are. I've been to a couple wonderful wedding receptions at the Catholic Church that's right off downtown Charlotte, that really old, wonderful church. Couple of our people in our department got married there, their second or third marriages, even though you can't do that in Catholic churches, but they did. But so it ties to that idea of community too, right? And so my wondering about was sort of looking at this, the ideal values of church buildings built in a certain era versus the realized values of what the community actually is living and practicing. And I wondered if that, linking that to the fact that younger people are not as religious. They don't have strong affiliations with churches. And so, when we enter a church, it's for these celebrations of other aspects of our communal shared life, a wedding, my family's had a bunch of weddings. None of them go to church at all, but they go for weddings. So I just thought that was interesting, that communal spirit.
Yeah, and I think the need for connection is still very much in us. As I mentioned with our, animal human drives, the top two after play or above play, building on play, are the belonging need, and then need for meaning or even immortality. And so I think young people today, through their social media, through, using their cell phone from infancy to connect with others, they do find connection, but it's a more individual way. Being on the screen with many people, but also then facing likes and dislikes and the competition for attention through those many, many more people, but alone often physically. And that's many people, scientists have been researching the increase in suicide rates and depression in young people, especially women and our students, because of, in relation to that. So I think what you're mentioning is very important, how churches provide a communal space where people accept one another. And then, there's that positive side to church history, but I see it emphasized even more in Buddhism, in even the architecture and imagery of Buddhist temples, where you can walk in while the monks are chanting, with lay people like in that image I showed, and walk around the hall. They might, rope off that particular area, but you can still go around and people are still talking, and people, it's like you blend into the sacred space, and it's very inclusive instead of the problem of exclusivity, which often happens, and I am afraid is part of our current politics in conservative religious people, sometimes having fear of those who want to be more diverse or change society, and seeing that as evil. So the connection, is vital for all of us. But when it becomes hyper competitive, that's where I see the melodramatic problem. Yes, Cheng Wei, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just want to point out that the Buddhism in China has been converted, to adapt to the Chinese culture, like all the way back in the 8th, 9th century. So like China is just like one example of the Eastern culture, that you're trying to compare with the West. So how do you account for that nuance, that's unique to China? And also, as I spent I pretty much grew up in China, and when I was little, and I feel like these days, the older and younger generation, they just resort to temple worship in China, just uh, like a trade. It's more secularized. It's like, oh, I would like to pass this exam, I would like to have a baby, and then I go to the temple, and then for the rest of their lives they just don't really worship there. So I'm wondering whether your book touches upon the secularization of Buddhism.
Thank you, Cheng Wei. Those are both great points, and coming from your experiences too. So Buddhism, as I understand it, Buddhism's journey from India first was through China, and therefore that very much influenced Japanese Buddhism, Southeast Asian, and then Tibetan Buddhism as well. So we in the West often, get Tibetan Buddhism as an influence popularized here, but earlier it was developing in China. So I wish I had more lifetimes to explore all those other areas and their temples, but I'll probably stay with the comparisons to China, acknowledging, what you mentioned. And then, yes, I did ask people, how often do you come to temple? If I didn't feel that was the wrong question, but and I often got the response, oh, twice a month, maybe. And I noticed and also read about how much the laity, the popular attendance in temples, is for, as you said, seeking help from the Buddhas. And so it is very transactional in that way, leaving an offering of burning spirit money, as it's called, even burning for deceased relatives, larger cardboard objects that represent a house or a car or something, and incense or candle lighting, and even leaving food. So some moving things I saw about that attempt to connect, as Teresa brought up as well, to the spirits or ancestors, which is extremely important in the Chinese tradition, emphasized more than in the Western. So I do acknowledge in the book, how the Buddhist philosophy teachings and how it's been developed in the West, especially with mindfulness-based stress reduction and therapies, is not practiced that much, even by monks in China. And it's much more, open. Actually, Buddhism is open. I've talked to a couple monks about this, open to what the people want. Even if the teaching is about non-attachment, about self-dissolution, if people want some connection to ancestors, some help with their personal life problems involving their attachments, the Buddhist monks will help them. And I even was listening to a talk last night by Kosho Finch, who does wonderful talks online. I recommend from his Portland temple, Shingon Japanese Buddhism. But he was talking about how because it's esoteric Buddhism, he does exorcisms sometimes if it's warranted. So there's even, that way of helping people. But he made a distinction, which helped me too. Instead of the Catholic notion or Christian tradition of conquering the evil spirit, it's about helping the evil spirit, rebalancing the situation. Because every spirit, every living being, even animals, of course, are considered to be progressing towards enlightenment. And so the attitude is to help them, not conquer them. They're not purely evil, they're just misguided and suffering themselves. So that's what I value in Buddhism, but realizing, as you brought up, the complexity of the different attitudes of people in temples. Andrew, what would you like to add?
Just real quick, and I'm sorry if it's not very well formulated, but it got me thinking, the whole discussion or talk, as well as Cheng Wei's latest comment, got me thinking about the fact of literacy and how that might influence spaces of worship. The Catholic spectatorial tradition versus the Protestant participatorial tradition.
Yeah.
As we go into this, as you mentioned, age where perhaps people feel they don't need a church, even if they are, quote, spiritual, right? That trajectory, especially as it relates to China. I mean, we have a country that has completely revolutionized itself in many ways, but especially in terms of literacy, and how that may or may not, comparatively speaking with the West as well, have an effect on temple worship, temple structure in ways that we don't even know at the moment because the change has been so rapid and so quick. Will this result in a sort of, insofar as we see China as, as much as that it is different, it's so much like Western societies today as well, a homogenizing of, say, spiritual attitudes or spiritual space, both in the West and in the East? Or will there be, in a way, like a novel development from this increase in literacy, from this, and how that might have effect on sacred spaces in the East as well? I don't know. It's not really a question. It's more of just like, it's got me thinking about these things.
Oh, that's great. You're like me, Andrew. You're like, what do we see from the past and how might it show trajectories toward the future? So just quickly, the difference between the Catholic and the Protestant you mentioned is very important and something that I try to map in the book as well. Because there's, as you well know, there was iconoclasm with the Reformation, often stripping out of imagery in Protestant church space and redesigning them, especially here in the US, so that they often become more communal or fan-shaped, more, auditoriums of performance with choirs, with a lot of preaching, with emphasis on the Bible, rather than what, Teresa was bringing up, and Aaron as well, with the cryptic spaces and, communal dimension of belief in the imagery itself and its relics as having spiritual power. So I did try to contend with that, and then consider how Mary also disappears as an object of intercessory worship or veneration is the better term, because it was seen as idolatry. So what replaces that? And I think it's, yes, because I teach a course on this here in UNC Charlotte, and often I ask my students to do field work, as an assignment. So often they're coming back with Protestant churches, which we have many of here in various forms, sometimes very corporate too, designed to be that way. Mm-hmm. So the connection to capitalism, profit making, the prosperity gospel idea, you give money and attend church and you will get blessings from God, including monetary in return, is very different. Although, ironically, part of maybe what inspired the Protestant Reformation, because there were indulgences sold, which made the church wealthy, which contributed to the beautiful art, but also people saw, again, as exploiting them. Indulgences were, of course, the priest will do special rituals for your departed loved one or for you, so that you will not suffer as much in purgatory, on your way to heaven, or your loved one who's suffering now. And it appears in Shakespeare's Hamlet with the ghost coming and saying, I'm suffering, but he wants revenge. It's more of that melodramatic mode for him, maybe why he's in purgatory. So how that relates to China, I think, is fascinating. I've visited half a dozen times, mostly 2012 to 14, then again in 2019 before the pandemic. But things have changed. Things changed greatly before that, because, as Cheng Wei brought up, there was no religion allowed in China, right, from the 40s to the 80s. And then the temples were rebuilt, or they had been turned into warehouses and they were rededicated. The monks, as I understand, were even paid as employees of the state, as with these cultural sites, to making them functional again, because the there was thought by the, again, very top-down communist government to be a lack of morality, a moral crisis, it was called. So that bringing back religion, even though communism had been atheist, bringing it back was a way to improve society, and that interdependent element that I mentioned in the book focuses on. So how that then shifted, through recent developments, with the competition, increasing competition through the Trump presidency and even the Biden presidency, between the US and China, and also with COVID, the zero COVID policy, where people were locked up in their apartments for months and they rebelled, even though it's very dangerous to do so. How that then, makes church community a potentially dangerous space for the government, but also a way that people can connect with a greater sense of meaning through that cosmic theater framework I mentioned. I don't know, but I hope that the hyper competitiveness between our two countries, between the US and China, as well as, involving Europe, will lead eventually, will also involve more cooperation and mutual understanding, especially if we can see how the traditions do have common origin in our human condition and brain networks, but also various alternative developments which we are still working on. So thank you all for joining. We went a little bit over, but you had some great responses and questions, which inspired me again. So again, thanks. Have a great rest of your
Thanks,
Friday.
Mark. Thanks, Mark. It was wonderful. Look forward to it. So look forward to having more discussions.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Mark. Ciao.
Bye. Ciao.